Welcome. My name is Marcy Bornstein. I'm the Director of Pre-College Programs at Brandeis University, and I'm just delighted to welcome everybody to this, our first inaugural Young Leaders Conference on Israel Studies Dialogue Series. We're so glad to have our alumni back. We're excited to have prospective students on the line. Tonight, we're going to have the chance to continue conversations that many of us began together on Brandeis last summer at the Young Leaders Conference on Israel Studies. We're going to dive deeper tonight into a conversation about media and democracy in Israel. Tonight is the first in a series of 3 webinars we'll be holding this semester, which will give you the opportunity to hear from current Brandeis graduate students as they share with you their expertise on the state of Israel. On this webinar are alumni of our first Young Leaders Conference on Israel Studies that we held at Brandeis last summer, as well as some prospective students interested in participating in the conference. We will be recording this and subsequent webinars to make them available to others as well. For alumni of YLC, of our Young Leaders Conference on Israel Studies, you may recognize some of our speakers, including tonight's speaker, Chen Arad, as some of our amazing faculty mentors from last summer. And for those of you thinking about coming to YLC this coming summer, here's a preview of the kind of conversations and the really amazing educators that you would have the opportunity to study with. So before we begin, let's just talk about how tonight's going to work. So what's going to happen right now, I'm going to do a little overview and introduction so we know what to expect. Then Chen's going to take over. He will speak for 20 minutes on media and Israel. Then he will pause, take questions. The way we will do question and answers is if you have a question, I will invite you to type your name in the chat box. And then I'll call on you in the order of folks that put their names down. You're all on mute right now, so when we call on you, we'll unmute you. And you will also have the option, if you want to start your video so that we can see who's speaking. So if that all sounds good and makes sense, can you just type in yes on your chat box so that I know everybody's there and this is working? Thank you. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Dana and Trevor and Daniel. Glad to see you guys there. So just a few guidelines for how we'll work tonight. Again, this is our first webinar, so we're going to roll with the punches. We do ask that everybody is muted when Chen's speaking or somebody else is speaking, and we've done that for you, so you're all set. I encourage everybody to be open-minded, to be curious, and to be prepared to ask questions. One of the things that we've learned from the Israel Conference at Brandeis is that when we bring a diverse group of students around the table to have really deep and meaningful conversations about Israel, the more questions and the more engaged we all are, the more interesting the conversation. So really excited to have you with us. Do remember that this is a place for continuous learning, so there are no dumb questions. If you have any technical difficulties at any point, feel free to write in the chat box privately to Kenyora. She can help you out. If somehow you get disconnected, you can also email Kenyora at kenyoraj@brandeis.edu. So tonight's speaker is Chen Arad, and he will be talking to us about media and democracy in Israel. Chen is originally from Hod HaSharon in Israel. He is the subscriptions marketing manager in North America and a regular blogger for the Israeli daily Haaretz. Formerly, Chen served for 3 years as an Israeli Defense Forces foreign press spokesman. He has worked as a news editor and for the popular Israeli website Ynet, and ran a fundraising campaign for the Israel Cancer Association. Chen received his undergraduate degree from Brandeis University, where he was a recipient of the Malkin Israeli Endowed Scholarship for Jewish-Israeli coexistence, and did research on the relationship between Jews in Israel and the United States. Chen is Chen is currently a graduate student at Brandeis, where his academic focuses are American history, East Asian studies, and politics. As an undergraduate, Chen co-founded Brandeis Visions for Israel in an Evolving World, BView, a student-run grassroots movement and conference seeking to create a more constructive discourse regarding Israel on American college campuses. And of course, Chen was one of our fabulous YLC faculty members this last summer. So now, without any further ado, please welcome me in welcoming Chen to start our webinar. Turning it over to you, Chen.
Something to gather that people can hear me. Okay, I was unmuted, so now people can hear me. Just give me a second. You know what? I'll start by just kind of following up on Marcy's presentation. Thank you for presenting me so kindly. And we are talking about the press and democracy in Israel today, and it's important for me to clarify that my perspective is very much of someone who worked as a journalist. So I'm not necessarily an academic who researched media, but more a practitioner who's been involved in media in Israel in many various capacities in Israel in the last few years, and that's my perspective. Just to clarify that right from the top, let me please try and share my screen, and please tell me if it's working, because I do wanna present you with a PowerPoint. Can someone tell me? Can someone just make a sign so that I'll know that it works? Looks like it does. All right, and I will say to those of you that I know, I saw that Dana was here and a few others of you. Thank you so much for joining tonight. It's very nice to see y'all again. It's been a few months, and it's great that you're here. So what I'm going to try and cover today, basically what I try to do is create a list of topics that I think are essential for anyone who wants to have a serious conversation about the media in Israel as it operates today. Of course, some of it goes a little bit into history and the foundation of free press in Israel. That's where we'll start. I think it's always valuable to compare things to America because of the, most of us here are American and we're talking in America. And after that, I want to talk a little bit about the special relationship that I believe Israelis have with their media. We'll continue to talk about key players, kind of give a survey of the Israeli media industry. What are the more important, the larger, more widely read or watched publications? What are the less read ones? Which one is more influential, etc. We'll continue to dealing with central challenges facing Israel and the Israeli media today. And finally, hopefully we'll have time. I want to talk about the scandal that's been known in Israel as the Bibi Noni scandal / the Yediot Gate, with a direct reference to Watergate, because that's how seriously people take it in Israel. I won't say too much right now. I'll leave you curious until the end. Alrighty, everyone can hear me, right? So I want to start a little bit with the legal foundation for freedom of speech in Israel. But let's start first with the United States. I just love this flag made of the First Amendment. I'm sure that you all know it by heart and chant it every morning when you get out of bed. It's critical when you talk about media to understand the difference between Israel and the United States, to think for a second about the First Amendment. And first of all, the fact that the United States has a constitution. And that constitution in the First Amendment says that the Congress shall make no law, and please let me jump a few lines downwards, abridging the freedom of the press, the freedom of speech or of the press. All right. In Israel, those of you who were with us this summer at YLC, you should know we don't have a constitution. But the fact that that early in American history, freedom of the press was inserted into such an important document makes a huge difference. It was later. It means that whenever there's an issue to do with freedom of the press, if it gets to the courts, then the courts have a very strong legal foundation to make sure that they. Sorry, I forgot to start my timer. I'll start it right now. The courts have a very strong foundation to make sure that freedom of the speech is not hurt. There are a few different examples from Schenck versus U.S. and Abrams versus U.S. early in the late second century of in the in 1917 and 1919 are one example. In 1964, the Supreme Court also ruled in New York Times versus Sullivan, again, based on the First Amendment, that basically giving the press a very strong leeway to do their to investigate, when it said that, and that's very important to remember, when it said that when the court said that as long as journalists in America do make an effort to seek truth when they report, even if they end up reporting something that is wrong, they cannot be sued for libel. I think that's, for those of you who are interested in media, that's really something worth looking into, especially in the current state of politics and the media in the United States, and the kind of almost declaration of war that sometimes seems to be coming from the current administration against the press. In Israel, as I mentioned, and those of you who are at YLC know, there is no constitution. I hope you appreciate my kind of artistic work here. These are two declarations of independence of Israel, and they are forming an X over the word constitution, because in Israel we don't have a constitution. The Israeli Declaration of Independence talks about liberty, it talks about democracy, it doesn't directly talk about freedom of the press. What that means, as it often means in a lot of other countries, that ultimately it falls oftentimes to the courts to have a lot of control on how free the press will be in a country. In Israel, I noted here on the bottom, as you can see, I'm not sure whether you can see my cursor, that a very important court case called the Bagatz Kol Ha'am in 1953 really set the precedence for a strong culture of freedom of the press, when the Israeli Ministry of Interior in 1953 was not happy with an opinion piece that severely criticized the Israeli government based on a false report by another newspaper, and as a result, he ordered to close the newspaper for 3 days. The newspaper appealed to the Supreme Court. Bagatz is short in Hebrew for the Supreme Court of Justice in Israel, and the court ruled that freedom of the press should be regarded very, very seriously, and that basically the government can't just shut down a newspaper even if they wrote something that wasn't 100% true, as was the case in that case. So that's a very important foundational court case. But again, keep in mind that in Israel there's no constitution, and the fact that there is freedom of the press in Israel is in many ways more shaky than it is in the United States, and we'll get to some of those challenges as we continue. Another thing that's very important to think about when you're contextualizing freedom of the press in Israel is size, and the fact that size and age matters. Remember that Israel is a very young state. If you think about it for a second, Israel is younger today than the United States was when during the American Civil War in the mid-19th century. So it really is, even though it feels like Israel was here forever, I mean, we still really are developing and molding and progressing with our democratic culture, and as part of that is freedom of the press. So on the one hand, that's a good thing because it means that we can still make a lot of improvements. On the other, it means that we should also be very careful because nothing is set in stone. Again, we don't have a constitution, and we don't have, like in the United States today, hundreds of years of a culture of freedom of the press. I wanted to give you this map. It is in Hebrew, so I'm sure many of you can read it, but just to emphasize what size means sometimes, it's very important. Just briefly, this is a map of control over media outlets in Israel, and where do they center? As you can see, the red circles that are kind of, have those rays around them, emphasize the key power centers of ownership in the media in Israel. We'll talk about many of these people whose names are in those circles later, but just you have to realize that there are 6, 7, maybe a little more that are smaller core power centers, basically private owners who exert a huge influence in the Israeli media. And notice, follow my cursor, and you'll see that this one, the one I'm circling right now, is actually the state of Israel. And we'll talk a little bit about public press in Israel, government-owned press in Israel, and the role that it plays as we continue. But out of the few people who control the media in terms of ownership, right? This doesn't necessarily mean that they tell journalists what to write or anything like that, but they're the people who own the media. One is the state of Israel, and that raises a lot of questions. And again, that's also in many ways the result of a small country that is also very young. It takes time for a media culture to develop properly. One really important thing to talk about in the context of Israel is censorship, and particularly censorship in a country that is constantly under an existential threats. We are surrounded by enemies, the state of Israel, and war is something that even people who are relatively young like me remember very well. Be it rocket fire or suicide bombings, and therefore censorship, basically a government action to prevent the media from publishing something, plays a very different role than it does in places like America that are not under existential threat. In America, there's a clear and present danger. Oh, I can see Ilan. Hi, Ilan. Sorry, suddenly I can see your video. You grabbed my attention. In America, the court set in the two court cases that I mentioned earlier, the Schenck versus US and Abrams versus US, the clear and present danger test, basically saying that only in situations where there's a clear and present danger, and that has to be proven in court, is it legal to actually censor and actually block a media outlet from publishing something. It also pertains to arresting people for speaking their mind and freedom of speech, not only freedom of press, but it's a very important test. In Israel, on the other hand, there's a very powerful censorship, and because of the existential threat that I mentioned earlier, it has powers that are very problematic from a democratic perspective. In Israel, the censorship can shut down a media outlet. The censorship can actually utilize eavesdropping on people without court order. It's important to clarify that these are not things that happen every day. In fact, eavesdropping without court order never happened, but according to Israeli law, the censorship can do it. It's a really interesting institution, censorship in Israel, because at the end of the day, it's headed by a brigadier general, which is a high rank in the army, but not the highest, but it's very independent. It's really a very, very powerful institution that is not actually legally, that is not in terms of governmental hierarchy, really subject to a lot of oversight. But what's important to understand that under that law, basically all Israeli media outlets are committed by law to submit materials that have to do with anything that is security related to the censorship to get approval. I can tell you that when I was in the army, when I was a spokesperson for the IDF, every public statement that we made would go first of all through the censorship to make sure that we're not releasing any information that is illegal. I mean, what could be illegal information to censor? Information that threatens, security. First of all, things that oftentimes in real-time events. So, say there are soldiers in enemy territory, and the journalist finds out, the censorship would not allow to publish it because it consists a risk to their lives. In other cases, very, very sensitive information pertaining to the nuclear technology that Israel reportedly, according to foreign sources, holds, often is also censored. I was also, last time I visited the censorship was when I worked as an editor for Ynet, which is a very large media outlet in Israel. It's a website that's read by a lot of Israelis. We'll talk about it later. It was pretty crazy to see that even though we would submit things that are considered security sensitive from a security perspective, they were very angry with us for not submitting enough. So there's really an expectation by the censorship to submit a lot of things. And for anyone who knows anything about the media, this obligation to have government supervision over information that a free press wants to publish is very problematic. But again, in some ways, it's explained by the fact that Israel is under existential threat. This is the Bus 300 affair and the newspaper Chadashot. That's the word there that is italicized. Just briefly for you to understand the power of censorship in Israel, that happened in 1984. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but basically there was a terror attack. Terrorists took over a bus. Soldiers infiltrated the bus, captured the terrorists, and gave them over to the Israeli, the equivalent of the FBI in Israel, the Shin Bet. The Shin Bet reported that they were dead when they got them, but then this photo was published by a newspaper called Chadashot. Even though the censorship clarified that this is considered sensitive from a security perspective, the newspaper published it anyway because it said, look, the Shin Bet is lying because obviously these agents are holding a live person. Ultimately, this resulted in, in a huge investigation, and the Shin Bet had to admit fault. But in the meantime, the government actually shut down Chadashot, which is the newspaper, for 3 whole days, ultimately resulting in its closure because it's lost so much money. So that hasn't happened anything like that since the mid-1980s, but still, just for you to understand the power of censorship in Israel over the media. Another thing that I wanted to bring up is this question that a lot of Israelis ask: is Israeli media a patriotic media, or is it a bunch of leftists? It's funny because I was a foreign press spokesman, and I would speak to foreign journalists constantly, and they would often complain about the fact that the Israeli media is very patriotic. What do they mean by that? I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. At the end of the day, again, it's a country under an existential threat. And even though we're journalists, and even though our job is first and foremost to criticize the government and to report, truly, oftentimes, when we are under rocket fire like everyone else, when our children, I don't have children yet, but, when you're a journalist and your children are serving in the army, and there's, say, a war or a terror attack, you often see the media kind of like closing down. I gave this example from the Israeli website YLC, another very popular website that launched a campaign saying, Kodem Kol Israeli, first and foremost Israeli. So basically saying, we're a news website, but first and foremost we're Israelis and we're loyal to Israel. That can be highly criticized by journalists, because should the media be loyal, to this nationalistic sense, or should it be loyal to first and foremost reporting everything that is true? At the same time, even though by the foreign press and by some people in Israel, the Israeli media is considered very patriotic, by many Israelis it's considered as a bunch of leftists. The Israeli media is considered as associated with Tel Aviv, the Tel Aviv bubble, that's very, very secular, very, very progressive and liberal. And, and there is some truth to the fact that a lot of newsrooms in Israel are populated by people who are more liberal. The same kind of argument is being made in America, so you can probably understand it to a large degree, by the current administration and by more conservative people. Some people say that because newsrooms here are populated by so many liberals, then the media failed in predicting how possible it was for Donald Trump to win the presidency, as one example. So it's kind of a constant struggle that Israeli journalists deal with. I mean, are we too patriotic, or are we actually a bunch of leftists? We're carrying both of these hats. In some ways you could say that, if you get criticism from a lot of directions, you must be doing something right. But at the same time, it's also not an easy position to be with. That being said, I gave you a bunch of circumstantial challenges that the Israeli media faces. It was also important for me to clarify that being said, the media in Israel is incredibly vibrant. It is very, very critical. It has on its belt some very, very successful campaigns, from putting prime ministers and politicians who were exposed by the media as corrupt in jail, like the former prime minister Ehud Olmert. His corruption and the investigation of his corruption scandals began in the media, to a campaign that the newspaper that I work for, Haaretz, ran against monopoly in the cellular phones industry, that resulted in a massive overhaul of the industry and reduction of prices. So yes, there are challenges, but also there's no question that the media in Israel is operating very well. It does a lot of good work. Challenges always exist, and always seems like the challenges are increasing, and we'll get to some of the most current challenges that people are talking about. But again, there's also a lot of place to appreciate that in such a young country, there's such a strong democratic culture of freedom of speech and a free press, where really you can say whatever you want almost about the government and about other people, and you're very rarely liable for libel or any other sanctions against you. So just was important for me to clarify that and not only say bad things. I did want to talk a little bit about the culture of media in Israel, and I thought this was a great anecdote. I took it out of the Jewish Virtual Library, but it's a story that I heard before, and I'll just read it. I'll just kind of reiterate it briefly. Basically, it's a story about an ambassador of a Western European country who came to meet the president of Israel. They're having a brief ceremony, and they're meeting, and suddenly the president looks at his watch and says, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I have to stop for a second." He turns on the radio. There's a series of beeps. It's a sound that is very familiar to all Israelis. It basically goes like this: beep, beep, beep. And then there's a newscast in Hebrew. It happens every hour. After that happens, the ambassador waits patiently and asks what happened. He was convinced that something terrible happened that warranted the president stopping a meeting in the middle and stopping a meeting in the middle and listening to the news, and the president just said no. It's just a habit. I can't not listen to the news every hour because I get stressed out about not knowing what's going on. I can speak for myself as an Israeli. Even here, when I'm in America, and I've been in America for 6 years, sometimes I look at my watch and I say, sorry, I just have to listen to the news right now, and I'll turn the news on my phone. Israelis are, probably the people that I know with the most push notification on their phones. Every time, say there's a rocket fired at Israel and you're surrounded by Israelis, you'll hear bzz, 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 bzz from all the phones, and you'll see everyone getting push notifications from at least 10 different Israeli websites. We're very much connected to the news, and that again, of course, goes back to the issue of the fact that Israel is a new country. We are under an existential threat. It's kind of like everyone knows everyone. You always want to know what's going on. So even though, as I mentioned earlier, there's some anger towards the media in Israel, on the one hand, people feel that the media is too lefty, or on the other hand, too patriotic. At the end of the day, Israelis are also very much connected to their media. It's different. I know a lot of journalists, and I hang out with journalists. I feel like in Israel, people know journalists. It's not like here where, famous national journalists, you'll probably never meet them or never see them. They're these like huge celebrities. Some journalists are very famous in Israel as well, but they're also, someone you might see on the street. You might have a beer next to, or, you might see them, taking their dog for a walk, or their children to the playground. Like, Israel is a small place, and even though there's tension between the public and the media and the government and the media, there's also a huge dependency on one another and a strong connection there. And that's me speaking as an Israeli. How am I doing on time? Not too bad. So I actually don't think I'll manage to go through the key players before our next 20 minutes. I see a chat. Is that for me? Sorry, let me open it. Alrighty. Thanks, Marcy. Sorry for that, everyone. So how about we do this? I'm going to try to go very briefly through some of the key players in Israel, in Israeli media. We might stop in the middle and then go back to it. But again, you can kind of see a lot of the media outlets and who owns them. Again, notice that it's not a lot of people. It's important for me. I can't stress enough how the Israeli media is small, and it's a challenge, but also an opportunity. Let's start with print. I will talk more briefly about some of the more immediate tension in the print industry in Israel right now. But generally speaking, print in Israel started pretty early, way before Israel was founded. Those who were at the YLC, and I'm sure that most of you know that Israel was founded in 1948, so not too long ago, but Israeli media, or more so Hebrew printed media, in what was then either an Ottoman territory or the British Mandate of Palestine. You can see print publications beginning to pop and appear in the mid-1800s. They begin to flourish a little bit before the founding of Israel. So, Haaretz, which is the newspaper here that I also work for, that, as I mentioned, is the oldest operating newspaper to date. It was founded in 1918. And then later, Yediot Achronot, which is this one, Ma'ariv, which does not appear here, were founded through the 20s. You see a lot of sectorial newspapers, like, for instance, these ones here, if you can see my cursor, that are associated. These are all newspapers that are associated with the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. They have their own flourishing print media. There's also a flourishing Israeli Arab media in the Arab language. And another thing that's important to say about the print media is that historically, as I noted here, it was very partisan. Basically, every Israeli party had their own newspaper at some point, or a newspaper that was associated with their views. Newspapers in Israel are still somewhat partisan and definitely are driven by political ideology, as we'll talk about a little later. Like, for instance, the newspaper here, I included on purpose Sheldon Adelson, the American gambling mogul, because he's the founder of this newspaper, Israel Hayom. And that's a newspaper that's strongly associated with Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister. In fact, there are reports that Benjamin Netanyahu actually asked Sheldon Adelson to create the newspaper, and we'll get in a little bit to the scandal surrounding it right now. But definitely, but there is a history of partisanship. It still exists to some degree, but it really used to be that, the Israeli Communist Party had a newspaper called Kol Ha'am. That's a newspaper that it got closed earlier, if you remember, during the court case that I mentioned in the very beginning. The Labour Party had a newspaper called Davar that's closed also since, just because it stopped making money. I do want to talk a little bit about the nature of these newspapers, and I'll start with Yediot Achronot. Yediot Achronot is really kind of one of the, it's a pillar of Israeli society. It's been a pillar of Israeli society for many years. I purposefully put on this picture. It's a picture, this particular cover is with shows Eyal Golan, a very famous Israeli singer. Yediot Achronot is highly read. It's very popular. It was actually founded by Arnon Moses after. It was founded, as I mentioned, in the mid 20s. It's considered, it's very, very popular. The vast majority of not the vast majority of Israelis read it, but a lot of Israelis read it. But in some ways, it's considered a little more, let's call it populistic or less intellectual. It does tend to be a little gossipy sometimes, even though it also has a lot of very serious journalists. Today, between 300 and 400,000 Israelis read it. It's about between 30 and 40% of the readership, depending on the study or when you're talking about it, but you have to understand that that's a huge share of the market. Israel Hayom comes in here because Israel Hayom is Israel Hayom is a very new newspaper. It was only founded, I believe, in 2007, again, according to reports, because Prime Minister Netanyahu asked Sheldon Adelson to open a newspaper to support him because he felt the media was against him. And we'll talk about why it became so popular, but it's also read by 300 to 400, even 500,000 people every day. Particularly, the larger numbers usually refer to weekend editions, and which constitutes 30 to 40% of Israeli readership. So really, if you look at Israeli print, you do have a lot of other publications. I mentioned the Arab publications, I mentioned the ultra-Orthodox publications, but the vast majority of Israelis read these two newspapers, Israel Hayom and Yediot Achronot today, so much so that another historic legacy newspaper, Ma'ariv, actually shut down for a while because it just couldn't handle the competition. It was then bought by Sheldon Adelson as well, and it's still being published, but it's not read by a lot of people. Haaretz, as I mentioned here, this beautiful picture with the glasses, kind of trying to demonstrate the intellectual nature and the more, kind of like liberal, progressive crowd that reads Haaretz. It is incredibly known abroad, but Americans are all, I think for most foreign journalists, for most people who are interested in Israel, for most Americans, when you think about an Israeli newspaper, then you think about Haaretz, which is probably the reason that many are surprised when they find out that very few people in Israel actually read this newspaper. In Hebrew, I think it varies between around 50,000 Israelis every day to under 100,000, so maybe like 90 or 80,000 a day. Again, it changes from time to time, but very few people read Haaretz. At the same time, it's considered a high-quality newspaper. It exerts a lot of influence. It's read by decision makers. In some ways, it's similar to the Washington Post, which has never been nationally in the United States very widely read, but it has been very widely known, and it is read by decision makers, and therefore, is still very, very influential. I will talk about the competition between Israel and Yediot Achronot in more detail a little later. It is important to say that, again, there are other publications that might be worth noting, particularly a publication called Makor Rishon. Very, very, it's considered, it's kind of like an equivalent of Haaretz. Haaretz, I don't think I mentioned it, is considered very, very lefty by a lot of people. And again, it's kind of funny that because it's on the one hand considered very lefty, which makes people abroad and kind of professional authorities, journalists worldwide, consider it more, more professional. But it's considered very lefty and very liberal. Makor Rishon is kind of an equivalent on the right. It's not read by a lot of people, in fact, significantly less than Haaretz even, but it's kind of like an intellectual conservative newspaper. That's about print. Marcy, I'm just gonna let you. I think it's been about 5 minutes since you sent me that message. So I think maybe I do have a lot more to talk about. But let's take a break, and I want to hear some questions. I've been talking a lot.
Great, thank you so much, Chen. This is I know that I have so many questions. What I want to experiment is I want to invite everybody that's on the call to turn on your video for a moment so we can just see everybody. So anybody that's comfortable doing, go ahead and turn on your video, and we'll kind of see who's in the room.
Hi, Dana.
And I also want to invite to open it up for questions. Chen has given us a lot of information about media historically in Israel, where we are now. And I'd love to hear what you're thinking, what questions are coming to your mind.
We're not afraid of silence. I know it's a little easier to not talk because we can't see all of you, but I really do want to hear your questions. So anything that pops to your head. Or I can do a pop quiz if you prefer that.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Who's that?
It's Daniel.
Daniel Minden. Hi.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically, I just wanted to know. I read somewhere that Haaretz, I know it's read by very, very few people now in Israel, but that there was a point where they almost became non-profitable and they almost had to close down, and that the only reason that they ended up staying in business was because they had a printing contract with Israel Hayom. In terms of the relationship between Israel Hayom and Haaretz, first of all, is that true? And second of all, is there any sort of publishing relationship between the two of them, or is it just strictly Yisrael Hayom uses Haaretz as printers?
So what you're saying is 100% true. There used to be a printing contract between Israel Hayom and Haaretz.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at the end of the day, Israel Hayom is a new newspaper, right? They founded the newspaper, they created the news bureau, they hired a lot of people, but they didn't have the facilities to print.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, they contacted Haaretz. Haaretz belongs to a family called Shoken, and that's not their only business. They do a lot of other printing business. So basically, they're basically a printing empire. In fact, they actually got a lot of their money came from businesses that they had in Germany that were confiscated by the German government.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, not too long ago, they during World War II, not too long ago, they won a settlement where the German government actually paid them. Oh no, not the German government. Actually, a particular a store in Berlin, I believe, had to pay them back a lot of money for property that used to be theirs. Anyway, so yes, that agreement used to exist. Some people say, and that's gossip, I'm not sure whether it's true, that even though Amos Shoken, the current publisher of Haaretz, is relatively liberal and progressive and is very outspoken about it, and Sheldon Adelson, the publisher of Israel Hayom, is the exact opposite, maybe even in a more radical sense, then they actually have a good relationship because of that joint effort. There isn't any kind of editorial cooperation between the two newspapers that I know of, and I can also speak as someone who works for Haaretz. I can tell you that there's a lot of kind of frowning upon the kind of journalism that Israel Hayom publishes among, it's not considered real journalists. There are reports, and I'll talk about it a little later, that there's sometimes Prime Minister Netanyahu would directly call Israel Hayom editor and would ask, please remove that article or add that article, please hire that journalist or add that journalist. But in terms of an actual relationship editorially between Israel and Haaretz, it doesn't really exist. Also, even though you would imagine that they're competitors because and I'll stop in a second because I hope other people have questions, because they promote such different agendas. They actually aren't. You'd see, and I'll talk a little bit about the competition between Israel and Yediot Achronot later, you'll see a lot of bashing there. Israel Hayom writing the Yediot Achronot is horrible, and vice versa. Haaretz and Israel Hayom and also other publications don't really see each other as competition. They really are kind of operating on very separate spheres. I'll also use this opportunity to say something that I wanted to say in the beginning. Please note that I'm giving you a survey of Israeli media in Hebrew. A lot of Americans, when they think about Israeli media, they think about what they can read, Israeli media in English. It's a very limited part of Israeli journalism. And Haaretz is really the only Israeli newspaper that's printed first and foremost in Hebrew, but also has a very strong English edition. But notice that everything I'm telling you is relevant almost only for Israeli media in Hebrew. Sorry, Daniel, did I even answer your question talking so long?
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Chen, we're going to go to Gabriella and then to Ilan.
Perfect.
Who both have questions lined up. So Gabriella, unmute yourself and you've got the floor.
So do you think that there's like a lot of popular like resentment or like a negative sentiment about the the like widespread censorship of media in Israel?
To be honest, my sense is that the only criticism of the way censorship is currently exerted in Israel is by human rights activists or lefty activists. It's not a concern of the widespread public. Even myself, I identify as a liberal and someone who's very concerned about freedom of the speech, about freedom of speech in Israel and freedom of the press. I can understand the need for censorship. In fact, I've been in situations where I know that censorship really helped protect the lives of soldiers. But I also reckon that there are a lot of cases where it sometimes, as often happens when things are justified by security, often it's utilized a little too liberally. Is it a concern of the major public in Israel? No, not really. I don't think that the average Israeli would tell you that they're concerned about the fact that censorship is used in Israel more often than it is in other liberal democracies.
Thank you, Chen. Elon, so good to see you all the way from Panama. You've got the floor.
Thank you. My question is, when people outside of Israel listen about the media, they think oh, Haaretz, and probably on the right they think Jerusalem Post, but they don't think about Yediot Ahronot or Israel Hayom or Ma'ariv or other newspapers which are the most popular and most read in Israel. So why do you think is that?
So first of all, I think you're exactly right. I mentioned it briefly. The average supporter of Israel from abroad does not necessarily think of all the publications that I mentioned. I think the reason is mostly that, the average people who reads Israeli news from abroad does not read it in Hebrew. He relies on a completely different set of sources. For instance, Times of Israel or the Jerusalem Post. Both are very good publications. You can like some of them less or some of them more, but good publications, but they're simply not read in Israel because they're not in Hebrew. They're essentially Israeli publications that are written for non-Israelis. There's no reason really for an American who just follows news from Israel to know Yediot Ahronot, unless he's really interested in Israeli media and Israeli culture and Israeli politics, because he can't really read it. I mean, Ynet, and I'll get to internet web publications in a second, is very popular in Israel, and it does have an English edition, but it's not really very strong. So the result is that think you guys are all very educated about Israel and definitely have a keen interest, but say you're just an average Joe in America, and you hear that something happened in Israel. There's conflict or there's an election, and you Google it. The first thing that would come out is probably Haaretz. You might even read your news. Actually, a lot of people probably prefer to read their news about Israel through American publications. And by the way, that's a whole other issue: the way Israel is covered by the foreign media and the fact that Israel is one of the most heavily populated country in the world per capita by foreign journalists. But the reason is quite simply the fact that the reason non-Israelis don't know these publications is quite simply because they can't read them because they're in Hebrew. Thank you. Good question. Elena, good to see you. And you too, Gabriela, I didn't get to say thanks for your question.
So thank you so much for those really great questions. Chen, I want to turn it back over to you to continue the lecture, and then let's pause it at about 8:05 or so to open it up again to a second round of questions. And if everybody wants to leave your video on, I think it's so nice to be able to see who's in the room with us tonight.
Yeah, please do. It is nice to see your faces. And also this way, I can see if you're yawning, or I can see if some of you are starting to fall asleep. So so I can call on you if you guys do any of those things. Anyway, I'm gonna start. This time I am setting my timer. So I think this more or less covers print. Again, this is a 40-minute presentation. If we remove questions, there's obviously so much else that we can talk about, but this is really the essence of print. Let's talk about radio for a little bit. That's another thing, Elon, you asked about, why do Americans know these Israeli publications and not other Israeli publications? I would venture to guess that the average American has no idea what are, popular Israeli radio stations, because who really reads or try to acquire news from another country using the radio, right? So I hope I'll teach you, or at least like share with you some new information in this realm. I mean, radio begins with the foundation of Israel. It's also more or less the time that radio begins to be a thing in general. In World War II, FDR used the radio to address people really effectively for the first time, and the same with the same happened in England and in other places. So Israel is founded in 1948, and with it, Kol Israel, which is this publication. It's basically Israeli state-owned media. Okay, it's a public station. A little bit later, in 1950, another station is created, and that is Galei Tzahal. Galei Tzahal literally means waves of the IDF. So IDF radio. And I put this picture on purpose because it was important for me that you'll realize that it's not only a state-owned station; it's actually operated by soldiers. And that leads me to to the second bullet here, that radio in Israel is really dominated, to a very large degree by state-owned stations. Okay, it's important in a few different ways. In particular, because the fact that, I don't know how many of you, I know a lot of you know a lot about Israel, and you probably know that there's mandatory military service in Israel. And that results, and that, oftentimes, even though, going to the military when you're 18 is not necessarily fun, it often provides really good professional training. So when you take kids who are 18 and very, very talented, and you make them, train for 3 years as journalists, they come out of those 3 years as very talented journalists. And you'll see that Galei Tzahal, Israel IDF radio, is actually a huge, it's basically the school of journalism for Israelis. And almost all of the big name Israeli journalists that or maybe you don't know, but they're famous in Israel, started in Israeli IDF radio. On the other hand, we are trying to think here constantly about what does all of these things that I'm saying about the media means to Israeli democracy. And it's important to recognize that, I don't actually have the numbers. I apologize. I probably should have prepared them, but I can tell you for sure that, if you include Kol Israel and Galei Tzahal, which are both talk radio stations, not necessarily music, and Galgalatz, which is kind of like a play of word on Galei Tzahal. The abbreviation is Galatz, and Galgalatz is a combination of the word wheel, Galgal, and Galatz, the station. It's by far the most popular radio station in Israel. It mostly plays music. It dictates what Israeli music Israelis listen to. If you take these three stations, it's the vast majority of Israelis listen to these stations. What does it mean that the three most popular and influential radio stations in Israel are owned by the government in one way or another? On the one hand, of course, it's questionable, no doubt about it. It can look very, very bad. But I will say, in defense of my many colleagues and friends who either report for these stations or listen to these stations, they actually provide very, very good journalism. When you think about like state-owned media, you should think not necessarily about on the American examples, or definitely not about Russian or Chinese examples where the state-run media is very pro-government. In Israel, they're actually very critical. They employ some of the best journalists in Israel. I will talk later about the future of state-owned media because there's some changes happening. But even though the radio field is dominated by state-owned stations, it's still very, very critical. And has a lot of very, very good journalists, and a lot of the biggest stories in the past 10 years were broken by radio journalists that worked for these stations. Also, kind of like generally when you think about the media, and that's relevant not only in the Israeli case, but in general, you should think about the kind of like media time circle. There are very particular times of the day in which people consume different kinds of music. Of news. Usually very early in the morning, people read the newspapers because that's when newspapers are published. But between the time frame of like 7 a.m. and 12 p.m., when people are driving to work, when people are starting to work and are, looking for something to listen to, that's when the radio dominates, and it exerts a lot of influence in Israel in that time. I did mention that there's increasing competition in recent years. Partially it's because, and we'll see the same thing happening with television journalism, television media, because there's more opening up for competition. I put in 102 FM, Radio Tel Aviv, which is a private station that was opened more recently and is becoming more popular. Galei Israel, which is a little bit more conservative and religious, actually, is another station that's growing in popularity. So we are seeing changes, but nonetheless, state-owned media runs the show when it comes to radio in Israel. Broadcast. So you have to understand, you're talking to someone like me. I was born in the late 80s. When I was a young in Israel, there were basically two things you could watch. The first was, Mabat, or Channel One, which is this logo. And I put here Chaim Yavin, who used to be kind of like the legendary anchor for Mabat for many years. He's kind of like the Walter Cronkite for media, for American media lovers. He's the Walter Cronkite of Israel. Walter Cronkite used to say, and that's the way it is, Chaim Yavin used to say, "Za kol hayom." And that's what kind of like every evening in Israel finished, and then people went to sleep. Every evening in Israel finished like that between the 1960s and the 1990s, and then people went to sleep. In the 1990s, like that's kind of like when I started, understanding what's going on. Then the first commercial channels start appearing. First and foremost, Channel 2, and Channel 2 basically takes. It's the first time that we had like actually television with ads. We didn't really have that before. The very kind of American way where they stop their ads and they try to sell you stuff, and then you go back to the content. Channel 2 very quickly, as I wrote down here, becomes the leader of the industry. It's news broadcast. There's the 8 p.m. news broadcast where everyone in Israel, we talked about the media time, like the media daily circle. That's when people watch TV. It's significantly more popular. It gets ratings of between 20 and 30, while the next channel is Channel 10. That's another commercial channel that was opened in the early 2000s, and Channel 1 today gets, in the single digits and even the lower single digits. News. In the early 2000s, you start seeing cable and satellite networks. They actually don't necessarily do a lot of news, but they really change the industry. People start watching TV not only for news, but also for a lot of other things. I will get into some new actors in the broadcast industry later, but it is really like, what I want you to come out of this with is that, when it comes to television in Israel and to television news, Channel 2 dominates. Channel 10 actually has a very strong news team, but it's just not watched by as many people. It's considered much more critical of the government. And Channel 11 is a whole other story where I'm going to get to it in a little bit, what's going to be the future of Israeli state-owned media. But, really Channel 2 is, in Hebrew we call it like the tribe's fire. It's what everyone sits around in the evening, to see what happened that day. It's good news, but it's also much more populistic in how it caters to the Israeli crowd. A little bit about internet. Needless to say, the internet is new in the mid, maybe a little bit in the late 90s, but really in the mid 2000s and onwards, it's becoming a more and more significant actor. Naturally, it's very dynamic, ever changing. Of course, there's a strong presence of other outlets, particularly the print outlets. Ynet, and you can see the small logo here is actually, it's the most widely read news website in Israel. It's read by about 1.5 million readers every day, which is massive. It started as the website of Yediot Achronot, the newspaper, only that now it's read by many, many more people. But so I used to work for Ynet, and kind of like a quick story. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the famous 2011 social justice protests in Israel. It was one of the most, some of the largest protests in the history of Israel. You just had the Women's March on DC, 4 or 5 million people, I think, nationwide. Which is a huge amount. You just had that now. In 2011, we had 500,000 people only in Tel Aviv. That's almost 10% of the population of Israel. And it's funny enough, it started one night when I was actually sitting there working as an editor, and my senior editor suddenly gets this phone call where someone is complaining about the price of cottage cheese. And the fact that, why is cottage cheese so expensive? And then they direct us to a Facebook page that had 100 likes at the time. That's considered a lot. Now Facebook looks completely different. That complains about, where people are complaining about why cottage cheese is so expensive. And I remember sitting there and seeing it was the head of the news desk saying, I think that's worth an article. So he publishes a small article about this. The next morning, it opens every single radio broadcast. By the end of the day, it was the opening of every single TV television news broadcast. And it became known as the cottage protests. that later, where Israelis started complaining about why are things so expensive in Israel. We don't make that much money, but things are becoming more and more expensive, and really starting to accuse the government. But and then it turned to the tent protest, where people started living in tents in Tel Aviv to protest the price of housing, and that turned into a massive social justice protest. That really shook Israel. You can still feel the influence today, and all of that started, by one guy who thought, there's a point to the fact that cottage cheese is too expensive, and published it on Ynet, which is such a popular publication. YLC News is another. YLC News is another very strong actor in the web web news in Israel. It kind of competes with Ynet constantly. And then I also, Haaretz, again, the print publications are very strong. Haaretz also has a very strong English edition. It's becoming more and more popular, actually, in Hebrew as well for Israeli readers. You have, Mako, which is one of the content providers for Channel 2 that has a very popular website as well. And then you also, of course, have, we are talking about the internet, a blogosphere. I mentioned Sicha Mekomit. I don't know how many of you can read the Hebrew here, but it's basically a website that's locally based. It takes articles from independent, non-paid local writers, but it already broke a lot of very, very important stories because it doesn't filter as much. It lets people, write things that for other publications would be considered, not necessarily worthy, but oftentimes are of interest to a lot of Israelis. So that's a little bit about the internet. If you have any questions, of course, you're welcome to ask them later. This is where I wanted to stop but didn't, so I'm just going to continue straight to a few central challenges facing Israeli media today. And this is just a selection. You can always talk about, you can always find more challenges, but just a few things that people like me who are obsessed with Israeli media talk about. First of all, you should keep in mind, you should know that according to Freedom House, which is an organization that ranks different varieties of freedom around the world, that's the Freedom House Index map for 2016. I don't know if you can see the small letters here. Green are countries where press is considered completely free. Yellow is where it's considered partly free, and the other countries is where it's considered not free. Until 2015, Israel was actually considered by that index. And of course, it's just one index, but you can see similar trends according to other measures of free press in other you can see similar trends in terms of a growing limitation of freedom of the press in Israel, according to other indexes as well. But in 2015, Israel was still considered a free press country, a country with free press. It changed for 2016, and I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why. There are two ways to look at this. One of them is, we see ourselves as, the strongest democracy in the Middle East, a real democracy. No one is ever going to tell me what to say or what not to say. Why are we considered so limited? We can also, on the other hand, you could also see that, in the Middle East, for instance, Israel is the only yellow country, unless you go here. I believe that's Oman, I believe. I'm not 100% sure. Don't quote me on it. But, in the Middle East, Israel is really the only non-dark country. We're the only one that is at least partly free. So, that's encouraging. You can also see that countries like Italy, that's considered, or Greece that are considered very developed countries that are part of the EU are considered partly free. But, as far as I'm concerned, I always try to compare Israel to, to the world's most developed countries. And it is concerning that we're not green like, Spain and Portugal and France here. So just something for you to consider. What are some of the reasons? First of all is the Israel Hayom question. I mentioned Israel Hayom, one of the print publications. It comes into the game in 2007. And immediately it is clear that it's publishing a very pro-Prime Minister Netanyahu line. 2007, Netanyahu actually wasn't prime minister yet. He was the head of the opposition. But this publication comes out and immediately gets, and it's very supportive of him, and it immediately becomes super popular. Why? Because, I don't know how many of you got to spend time in Israel, but every day, in almost every central traffic junction in Israel, you will see people wearing red overalls, handing out Israel Hayom copies. Basically, it's given out for free. It's published in massive, massive amounts. It's given out for free, and that ensures a very high exposure. Okay, so it becomes super popular, and that's not the only problem. It's funded by Sheldon Adelson, The estimation is that Sheldon Adelson invests at least, since 2007, has invested at least $10 million a year. Some say more, some say less. It's hard to say because, of course, he doesn't have to disclose it. But in this publication, he hires a lot of good journalists from other publications that cannot compete with the prices, with the wages that he offers. He offers also, and that's very important, we're going to talk about advertising revenues. He offers very low prices for ads, which means that other newspapers have to also reduce their prices in order to keep attracting advertisers, and are therefore losing revenue, even though they depend on it because they're not funded by a philanthropist. So the fact that there's a newspaper that's given out for free and that has a very distinct pro-Netanyahu line, and we'll talk a little bit again in the final slide about what does that mean, a very distinct Netanyahu line, then is one of the things cited in the Freedom House Index report for why Israel's level of freedom of speech was reduced. Another issue is the Ynet domino effect. Ynet, again, I mentioned as the web publication of Yediot Achronot. You see here Sheldon Adelson on the one hand, about to deal with Arnon Moses, who's the publisher of Yediot Achronot. Ynet is Yediot Achronot's web platform. Again, very, very popular. Generally speaking, even though many more people read publications online, there's much less income in that realm. Web ads don't give a lot of money. And as Israel Hayom comes into the scene, takes a lot of the market share from Yediot Achronot, takes a lot of the advertising share, and forces Yediot Achronot to reduce prices, both ads and copies. Ynet, as kind of a last resort, trying to increase their revenues, begin introducing a lot of commercial content. Commercial content means that you would go on a website, that you trust to be a real, a serious website that provides news, because it does provide a lot of serious news. You'd click on one of the articles, and one of those articles will actually be funded by, say, a ministry of the government. So the Israeli Ministry of Economy, ran by, at the moment by Minister Naftali, at the time he was ran by Minister Naftali Bennett. Now Naftali Bennett is the Minister of Education, actually signed a very long-term campaign. Okay, I'm gonna try to do this quickly because I do want to take your questions. Anyway, starts publishing articles that basically the Ministry of Economy signs an agreement with Ynet where they're going to publish a series of articles with content that's basically dictated by the ministry. So the fact that there's less that in Israel's most widely read news website, there's less reliable news because, as I mentioned, they're dictated by a ministry and they're funded, then really reduced Israel's freedom of press. I'm going to go a little more quickly from here on. Netanyahu in the media is also another issue. Fascinating to me. I'm not going to elaborate too much because I want to get to questions, but Prime Minister Netanyahu has been touted as someone who has an obsession for the media. That's part of the reason they say, again, this is all reports and some of it is gossip, but there's also a lot of there are also a lot of facts there. Part of the reason he insisted that he's not going to succeed unless he found a new newspaper comes into play that supports him. And it kind of seems to increase over the years to the degree where some people say that because of a law that was introduced into the parliament, into the last Knesset, that would have forced Israel Hayom to charge for its copies, Netanyahu decided to break the government and go to a new set of elections. After the elections, when he won again, he insisted on being the Minister of Communications, and he also insisted that every other party that signs a coalition agreement with Likud, his party, would commit to never challenge and always approve any legislation attempt or action taken by the Minister of Communications, Netanyahu. Under the head of the Minister of Communications, he's been trying to do all kinds of reforms. He presents it as introducing more competition, and of course, his opponents and many in the media present it as trying to weaken the media. He's been threatening to take away. Sorry, just a couple more minutes. I'm just going to finish, Marcy. Okay. He's been threatening to not give some money that was promised to Channel 10, for instance. That's very critical of him and stuff like that. So that's another reason that people tout as an increasing limitation for freedom of the press in Israel. The fact that the Israeli prime minister, who's very powerful, some people argue, fixated on the media. Very quickly, general trends as a whole, media makes less money in a lot of ways, particularly newspapers. You can see that, starting from when internet became a thing, ad income is decreasing, and that's 100% true for Israel as well. That's part of the reason that, as I mentioned, Yediot Achronot and YNET had to introduce some commercial contents. I did want to mention Yediot Gate. It's one of the biggest scandals happening in Israel right now, and honestly, it's just fascinating on its own. Yediot Gate, of course, as I mentioned, as a reference to the Watergate scandal. Basically, in the last election, it became more and more clear that there's a huge rivalry between Yediot Achronot, this guy, who you may not recognize, is Arnon Moses, also known as Noni Moses, the publisher of Yediot Achronot, and YNET. It becomes clear that YNET and Yediot Achronot are taking an incredibly anti-Netanyahu line. It wasn't even hidden. Just like Israel Hayom, it was very obvious he's taking a pro-Netanyahu line. Yediot Achronot is taking an anti-Netanyahu line. Netanyahu accuses them of doing that. He says they're not real news. And ultimately he wins the election, which was a huge blow for Yediot Achronot, and he's doing his best to harm Israel, to harm Yediot Achronot. By the way, it's important to clarify that Yediot Achronot is also not clear of issues. It was also clear that they're supporting a lot of other other politicians. They're very supporters of politicians that align with Arnon Moses's business interests, etc. Anyway, about a month and a half ago, a new scandal breaks out. The report is that there are recordings of Prime Minister Netanyahu talking to a famous Israeli business person about exchanging, basically about rubbing each other's hands. You'll give me something, I'll give you something, which of course is illegal for an acting politician. A day passes, and it turns out, my newspaper, of course, broke the story that business person is Arnon Moses, the publisher of Israel Hayom, that Netanyahu has basically been touting as the devil, a threat to democracy, a traitor, someone who's trying to ruin him politically. I don't know how many of you can read those dialogues, but basically they were actually, and there are recordings of this that are currently investigated by the police, and what is the police going to do with it, and whether they're going to start an actual, whether they're going to indict Prime Minister Netanyahu for corruption is still not clear. But basically, they were negotiating. Netanyahu said, Arnon Moses said, to the Prime Minister, if you will make sure that Israel Hayom, Yediot Achronot's competitor, does not compete, starts, closing down, becoming less popular. I know you have influence there. I'm going to make sure that you get more positive coverage. Netanyahu responds, okay, we can do it. We can even legislate a law to limit it, whatever you need. So basically, some very, very nasty stuff for any of you who watch House of Cards. It might remind you of that show. Some of the dirtiest politics you can imagine that pertains directly to Israeli media. I'll just finish by saying that when I was in Israel about a month ago, I went to meet my former employer, who's now the chief editor of YNET. The day after this story broke, he swore to me that he would never have accepted any kind of demands by the prime minister or by his publisher to be dictated to his staff. And I want to believe him, but there's no question that it casts a lot of doubt about the prime minister and above one of Israel's most popular publications. I'll stop here, and I really look forward to hearing your questions. And I'm happy to see the two people that I can see, Gavriela and Ilan, did not fall asleep. So thank you for that.
And actually, we have a bunch of questions lined up. We have Dana, then Gavriel, then Ilan, and Daniel. So let's start with Dana. Go ahead.
Hi. I was just thinking, because this is definitely a problem that we've had a lot in America too, how do you think news or media outlets can hold the government accountable for their actions, and vice versa, and how the government can make sure that the media, keep the media outlets accountable for their actions as well?
Well, the simplest, I think, answer to that is by simply doing their job. However, we know that it's not that simple, right? In Israel, it's tricky because, it's harder and harder for publications. And I think, Daniel, you asked earlier, and I don't remember if I answered you, about the profitability of Haaretz. There are different reports, but it's probably true that Haaretz is not profitable. It's probably also true that Israel Hayom is not profitable. The bottom line is that it's very hard to maintain a sustainable media publication in Israel, and therefore it means that for most media publications, it's hard to do their job, because on the one hand they have to write what interests people, and they have to be considerate of political interests, as the Yediot Gate story proves. But the bottom line is that they simply need to do their job to the best of their capability, and a journalist's job is to look for dirt and to publish it, not to do what the prime minister wants them to do, even though a politician's dynamic is naturally that politicians try to exert as much influence as they can over the media. Now, I think there is some truth to the counter argument, and many journalists don't really like to think about that aspect, but there is some truth to the counter argument that you're bringing up, Dana, that the media should also be held accountable. But I mentioned some of the court cases earlier, so during the election, I read a great article in the New Yorker. At some point, Donald Trump said it shouldn't be considered freedom of the press if the press publishes blatant lies. The truth is that according to the American legal system, and that took a lot of thinking and a lot of judges who weighed down the Constitution and a lot of trial and error, journalists are allowed to report things that are not precise. And the reason is that as long as they can prove that they did their best to at least try and find the truth, the court repeatedly ruled that it's more important that journalists would feel free to make allegations than it is that they would be 100% precise. Because the moment journalists are afraid to say the truth, to report, even if they can't know everything for sure, that's part of the nature of the profession, right? You're looking for information that you can't find fully always, but the moment journalists are afraid to say what they think they found out, then they can't do their job. So yes.
I'm gonna cut you off, if you don't mind, just for a minute, because we have 15 minutes left, and I want to be sure that we get to the remaining questions.
Of course. So I hope I answered your question, Dana. But the bottom line is just politicians should do their job and focus on doing their job, not on the media. Journalists should do their job, which is to focus on politicians.
Great. Okay, Gabriella, you had a question.
Yeah, I actually have two questions. Is it okay if I ask two? All right.
Ask them both, and we'll have Chen either choose one of them or answer them both quickly for you.
All right. So my first question is, so I know that there's been, like, around the world, but also in Israel particularly, there's been a rise in English proficiency. So I was wondering if you think that's been, like, there's been a big enough shift there for that to affect media consumption there. And the other thing is, it seemed like with like Israel Hayom and then the Yediot Gate, like, a lot of it seemed like there was, like, sort of an issue of media becoming government propaganda, and I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Well,
great questions.
So I'll do my best to answer quickly because I want to hear all your questions, but these are really good questions. First of all, I mean, I can tell you, for instance, for Haaretz, and I deal a lot with with the marketing aspects of our work. English proficiency means a lot. A lot of our income comes from our English subscribers. Those are the majority of those are not based in Israel, but are American Jews. But there are a lot, and increasingly who are based in Israel. Of course, part of it are immigrants who moved to Israel and spoke English. So that's one way of looking at this. Yes, there are more. There's more market. It's still not huge, but more market for Israeli publications in English in Israel. Another way of looking at it is just the fact that Israelis can now get a lot of their information because of English proficiency from non-Israeli publications. So as one example, we once had a promotion with the New York Times where Haaretz had a promotion with the New York Times where we offered a discount to the New York Times, and the New York Times offered a discount to Haaretz. Many Haaretz subscribers used it to get a subscription to the New York Times. Very few New York Times subscribers used it to get a subscription to Haaretz. So I think you're thinking very sharply here, thinking that, like, Israelis are more open to publications that are not Israeli. So definitely, it's at the same time, though, at the end of the day, Israeli media still is the best at reporting on things that are happening in Israel. Good questions. I answered both, right? No, I didn't answer the second question. Sorry. The second question was the media used as a tool by politicians. I mean, a lot of journalists thought they're doing a really, really good job criticizing Donald Trump very, very critically. But the fact is that it turned out in many, many ways that he was really doing a really good job manipulating the media. and he got a lot of coverage, and it played an important role in him winning the election. So definitely true. I mean, you can see that in Yediot Gate as well. It's a challenge for journalists. Like, I mean, it relates to the question that Dana asked. It's a challenge for journalists. Again, I think that as long as journalists really focus on doing their job, which means, sometimes, focusing less on making money and more on just trying to reveal the truth. I mean, that's really the best way to deal with it. But I think you're right. It's a phenomenon that's very disconcerting.
Okay.
We have a question, Gabriela?
From Ilan and then from Daniel.
Thanks. So my question is, like, many of the scandals that I've heard from Israel have been very small, especially compared to what we hear in Panama. So we heard about the wife of the prime minister wanting to buy gourmet ice cream and leather sofa. And once Yitzhak Rabin was taken out because he had a bank account of $500 in the U.S. But now it seems like it's more concerning. It touches on the media. So do you think this scandal is different than others we have seen in Israel in the past?
First of all, I think that it's important to note what I mentioned earlier. At the end of the day, as an Israeli, I want to hold Israel to the same standards that are used to evaluate, Western liberal democracies. Not to say anything bad about Panama, but, we consider ourselves a liberal democracy. And, we've put prime ministers and presidents and ministers in jail for corruption. And we hope that it keeps that way. So even if it means sometimes focusing on things that sounds relatively small, but, the Israeli public has the right to know if the prime minister's office spends hundreds of thousands of shekels a year on expensive ice cream, and why doesn't the prime minister use his own, salary to buy that? So that's like, just referring to the particular scandal that you mentioned. Are these scandals bigger than others? I mean, I think the answer is probably yes. I can tell you that from what I've been hearing and reading, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert is currently sitting in jail for accusations that, fiscally, in terms of the amount of money they had to do with, amounts to 1/10 of what Netanyahu is currently being accused of. We hear a lot about it from reports. We're not necessarily getting full information, but the Yediot Gate scandal, another corruption scandal that Netanyahu is currently being investigated for, and another scandal that seems to be amounting to something real to do with a submarine deal between Israel and Germany that some friends of Netanyahu were involved with. It seems like there's something there. At the same time, Netanyahu is a very smart politician, so you can never know 100%. But again, the things he's accused for are 10 times more severe than what Prime Minister Olmert is currently in jail for. So can't promise you, but I think keep watching because it's going to get more interesting.
Okay, and Daniel has the last question of the evening.
Can you hear me now? Hello? Can you hear me?
Hey, Daniel, how are you?
Hi, okay, very good, thank you. I actually have two questions. I hope you'll forgive me for having two questions. But my first question is this. It seems to me, and I'm a reader of Haaretz and a big fan of Haaretz, it seems to me just by talking with Israelis when I was there this summer and Israelis who are expats and who live in Canada, that there's almost this belief that Haaretz is not patriotic, hates Israel, and has this vendetta against Israel, and it just seems like there's this huge hatred shown towards Haaretz. And I guess my question is, in the United States, there are newspapers like the New York Times, which are considered liberal and intellectual, but are still considered mainstream, and they're read by millions and millions and millions of people. And those are the newspapers which have, in fact, the greatest, readership in the U.S. So my question is, why in Israel is the newspaper that is, sort of sophisticated and liberal marginalized and, almost hated by so many people? Sorry for being harsh on you, but
that's all right. And how about let me answer this question, and then you can ask another question, because I don't want to forget all the very important points that you raised. Okay, I think you're touching on a lot of things that I mentioned. And first of all, the difference between Israel and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the reason that an intellectual, more critical newspaper can be that much more successful in America is the size of America, is the age of American society. We're not operating in the same realm, really. Okay, so that's my first point. I think also to really accuse Haaretz as as being anti-Israeli is to really not understand the role of the media. I sometimes read articles, particularly in the opinion pages, that to say it, excuse my French, piss me off. Okay, but I think people oftentimes don't make this distinction between the opinion pages where people are writing for themselves and news. If you look at news, Haaretz, in my view, does the best job covering issues that are important for Israeli society. And to say that it's anti-Israeli is really not understanding that, for a newspaper to do its job, it has to be anti-government. It has to constantly question the way the military operates. It has to constantly question, the people who are currently in charge. That's the point. Mm-hmm. That being said, I also think that a newspaper is, journalists are like a weird kind of people. They never stop questioning themselves. Okay, and that's what we should keep on doing. It's not an easy job. People think of journalists as these like fancy stars who are doing this magnificent job and are heroes of society. And I think in many ways it's true. It's a very honorable profession, but it's not a glamorous one necessarily. The best journalists that I know spend most of their time, digging through papers and trying to uncover things that no one else wants to do. And sometimes that means being a little hated, but also we need to question ourselves and see, constantly if there's merit in the accusations against us. Mm-hmm. Has there been sometimes lines of coverage of certain issues that I think Haaretz, could have, maybe included more of the Israeli side of things? Yes, it's true. There's always a place to improve. Nonetheless, Nonetheless, I think the way Haaretz operates is essential for Israel, and Israel's democracy would be at a far worse place without it.
Okay, very interesting.
Last question.
Yeah, very good answer. My last question is this: in Canada and in Britain, as far as I know, the government really only funds one sort of public broadcaster, and in Canada it's the CBC, in Britain it's the BBC. We don't really have a whole spectrum of broadcasters that the government funds. So my question is, why in Israel are there so many broadcasters funded by the government? Why not just have one? I guess, do they have different purposes, or what's the point of that?
So actually, I think. Oh, sorry. I didn't get to talk about new players. I'll mention briefly. This is Channel 20. It's a new channel that's considered the Israeli Fox News. It's becoming more and more popular. Look into it if you want to. But I did added the future of public media, because right now there's a kind of like a revolution going on. They're closing down the old public broadcast and they're creating a new one called Kan, which means here. I don't know if you're talking about radio. In radio, really, there are a few, like it's really dominated by government-run stations. When it comes to TV, really Channel 1 that's going to be replaced by this new channel is the only one. So it's not that many. There are a few other kind of like auxiliary channels. So there's a channel in Arabic, there's a channel in English, because Israel's national languages are Hebrew, English, and Arabic. So there has to be like a national channel to provide these kind of like basic TV services to everyone. There's an educational channel. Even if I don't think it's actually more than it is in other countries necessarily. And even if it's quite a few channels, it doesn't exert that much influence. Mm-hmm. I actually am a big believer in state-run media, as long as it's state-run media the way it's done in the UK with the BBC, and the way it's done in Israel to a large degree with our very critical publications. At the end of the day, journalism, and I'll use this as kind of a platform to make my pitch. Journalism is just as important as other branches of government. You can't have a democracy without an executive branch. You can't have a democracy without a judicial branch. You can't have a democracy without a legislative branch, and you can't have a democracy without a free press, because if you don't have someone to hold people accountable, you won't work. And I think that in healthy societies, that often means that it needs to be supported by the money that we give the government as taxes. And that's why, to me, public state-run media makes a lot of sense as long as it really is free and critical state-run media that fulfills the role of journalists. I'll finish here.
Chen, thank you so much. Our conference last summer was really addressed this big question of what does it mean for Israel to be a Jewish and democratic state? And the way that you just finished saying that we can't have a democratic state without freedom of press, I think really just brings home what a salient and important conversation this was. So thank you so much for taking us through so much history and so much insight and depth into the conversation. If everybody, we're going to just give like a virtual thank you and thumbs up to Chen for a great talk. I know that I got a lot out of it. I also, a huge thumbs up to the students on the panel tonight. Your questions were fabulous, really provocative. We could have kept going so much longer. I just want to tell you that this is just the first of three webinars that we have planned for you. So coming up, the next one will be on March 19th with Amber Taylor. The title of the talk will be coming. On April 5th, we'll have Karen Spira. Karen, you may remember, was one of our fabulous mentors last summer. So she will be talking about again. I also want to tell you that you can invite friends and others to join the webinars. So this is really open. We design these webinars primarily for our alumni of our program, but we really want to welcome as many folks into the conversation as possible. Also, just throwing out there that if you, Daniel, it was great to have you on the conversation. We'd love to have you join us this summer. And for any of you, if you have friends that you think would gain and be able to contribute to the YLC conference, we'd love to hear from them as well. So just wonderful to see you all and hear you all and be part of this conversation. And I hope we see you in the next two webinars. We look in your inbox for invitations to those webinars. Also keep an eye out in your inbox for a survey that Kenyora will be sending out to just ask you how this webinar went. This is the first time we've done it, so we'd love your feedback. Okay, so thank you, Chen. Thank you.
I'll just mention briefly that I wrote down my email, and if anyone has any follow-up questions about this or any other issues pertaining to Israeli democracy, please feel free. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Chen, for making yourself available to the students. And we'll also include Chen's email in the follow-up. This webinar has also been recorded, so you're welcome to revisit it or share it with folks you think will be interested. Good night. Laila Tov, and thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.